On this episode of The Cave and the Fire, we pick up again sacred masculinity. For many men, masculinity is something they inherit through culture, through their family, through school, through their communities, their churches, their synagogues. But for Terry Symens-Bucher, masculinity has been a question he's been living his entire life.
I have been involved in men's work since I was a boy. Always was haunted by the question and obsessed and blessed by the question and cursed by the question, what is a man? What is a real man? Not only what is a man, but what is a real man?
Terry has spent decades living that question. From his early years in the Marines, into his time as a Franciscan, his participation in numerous spiritual communities along the way, all the way into his recent decades in which he has deeply shaped the work of Illuman. All along the way, he's lived it and discovered something about power, patriarchy, masculinity, and fear.
The power that I'm talking about when I use the word patriarchy, it's power that's based on fear. It doesn't work without fear. This is the most powerful prayer I've ever heard in my life. There was a friar and we were just sharing, and then we went into prayer. And this friar, who was probably one of the most unassuming men that I've ever run into, just very humble, his prayer was this. He says, "May no one ever be afraid of me." And that struck me because I looked at him and I thought, why would anyone ever be afraid of you? You seem like the most innocent, kind of harmless person. Not powerful, but harmless. And then I realized that he was probably that way because he had been saying that prayer a long time.
For Terry, the real work of masculinity isn't domination, it's transformation. It's the work of becoming whole. And I asked him, what are the gifts the sacred masculine has to offer the world?
That is such a profound question, and I hesitate to answer because I'm not sure that we even have the language yet.
Still, over decades of reflection and experience, one truth has become clear to him.
We have to be mystics. I would say the sacred masculine is a mystic. He is in touch with his core. He is in touch with the divine. He knows how to dance with the divine. He knows how to listen to the divine. He knows how to let the divine have its way with him.
And that work matters now more than ever because many young men today are searching for meaning in places that ultimately cannot provide it.
Meaning and your purpose in life. It's not out there. You're not going to find it in the economic system. You're not going to find it. It will keep you going for a bit and you can use it, but you're going to have to find your way through your heart and through your own relationship with the sacred, with the divine.
In our conversation, Terry reflects on masculinity, spirituality, shadow work, and the future of men's communities. And he speaks to the seeming paradox at the heart of transformation.
No one can do this work for you. You are on your own. Absolutely, each one of us. And we can do it together.
This is a conversation about the lifelong journey of becoming a man. Join us on The Cave and the Fire.
Terry Symens-Bucher, I'm so grateful to be able to talk with you today. And really, out at the very front, I'm just really grateful for you, for your life. You have impacted a lot of men and women, just people, but you've impacted me. And so thank you for being an elder to me and kind of showing me the ropes and continuing to mentor me among so many other people. And thanks for being willing to have this conversation today.
Thank you, Ned. That's so kind. And I want to thank you because this ability to let men have a voice, within the community, I think is really important. Joanna Macy once said, the voice that we most need to hear at this time is our own. And she certainly didn't mean that in any selfish way, but we need to find our voice. And so for me, the work, men's work in a lot of ways is helping men, helping each other find our voices. And I think that your work in Illuman and what you're doing even right here in this podcast is really manifesting that intention. So thanks.
You've been involved in Illuman, I mean, since the very beginning. And you already mentioned Joanna Macy as well, as another teacher that has been a huge part of you and your partner, your wife, Anne, her life. I'd be curious to know where you'd want to start the conversation around how you even first got involved in this work, how you got connected to Richard. Yeah. And I know already that you could even go back to, your Franciscan journey, which would probably preceded even Richard. So wherever you want to start there, I'm all ears.
Okay. So on one level, I'd have to say I have been involved in men's work since I was a boy and even knew there was something called a man, in that sense. Always was haunted by the question and obsessed and blessed by the question and cursed by the question, what is a man? What is a real man? Not only what is a man, but what is a real man? And so as I look back on my life, I can really see that as a thread, that thread that William Stafford talks about in that poem. There's a thread that you follow. I can see that as one of the threads that I followed all my life. What is a man and what does a man do? But specifically to, say Richard, I was with the Franciscan community as studying to be ordained on the West Coast here in Berkeley back in the early 80s. And I remember when I was in novitiate, this is 1981 now, in novitiate, there were a few of us who got together in our novitiate class. We'd huddle down in this little circle in the evening, and we'd get this cassette player out, and we pull out a cassette. And this one guy had all these cassettes, and he'd pop it into the cassette player. And this guy, this priest from New Jerusalem community, would start talking. And it was just, we loved it. It was just inspiring, and it was like a breath of fresh air. We really connected with his Franciscanism and his vision of the church, etc. And then I eventually met Richard as a Franciscan. We didn't have, he was in a different province and all, but I did meet him there. But then I have to jump to 2006. And I had a heart attack. It was unexpected, probably like most heart attacks are, but this one was really unexpected because I had none of the red flags, that Western medicine puts on people who are prone to have heart attacks. So it did, in that sense, come out of the blue. And then I had bypass surgery. So it was, and I would say in some ways, the bypass surgery was more traumatic than the heart attack itself. I really had something to ponder, like a heart attack. What does that mean? Not only on the physical level, but on the emotional, psychic, and spiritual level. And I was really led down a path, of pondering this idea of a hard heart and a broken heart and a heart that is attacked. So I had known that Richard was doing men's work and men's rites of passage for a while. But I had kids. I was a householder. I had a job. And I kept saying, someday, someday, someday. But when the heart attack happened, one of the first things that I decided, I said, next time I have an opportunity to do one of those men's retreats, rites of passage, I'm going. And the next one that popped up was in Texas in 2007, and I went. And that's where I was introduced to the men's rites of passage. And then jump forward from there. And I stayed in connection with men in Northern California who were working with Richard and Stephen Pica. And then in 2014, knowing that Illuman had become its own entity separate from the Center for Action and Contemplation, I was invited to join the board, and I accepted that, very gratefully accepted that invitation, and saw it as a way to really deepen and get even more serious about what I was doing in my own life, but also supporting men to do their work. And from the board, I became the chair, and I've been involved since then. Love the work, committed to the work, and I currently serve on the Council of Elders and as a trustee.
So let's go back and also pick up this thread with Joanna, because I think it's I just think it's fascinating to follow that. For those who don't know, Joanna Macy, a Buddhist thinker, she was really a bridge from the East. Many of us have read her without knowing it when we've read Rilke. She did a lot of translation of Rilke's work. She passed on just in this past September. She actually was key to, Richard drew on some of her work, which is called The Work That Reconnects. And she created a lot of just powerful ceremonies or rituals that Richard drew on for part of the grief work that belongs within the Men's Rites of Passage. And we've drawn on her in other places. When did you and Anne first get connected to Joanna?
Well, so Anne, my wife, has a story back to the 80s where she first, really powerful story, her own personal story of being in connection with Joanna and what back then was called, Joanna's work was called Despair and Empowerment in the Nuclear Age. So she was working with helping people to be able to connect with their despair and their grief around what was happening in the world back in the early 80s. And so Anne went to one of those and was powerfully touched and moved. And she was working for the Franciscans and really had some connection with Joanna, but not a lot. Until 2006, she got the program she was running with the Franciscans was terminated, and so she was free. And pretty soon after that, as these things happen, she had lunch with Joanna, and they were just kind of chatting. And the way Anne talks about it, Joanna at the end of the meal said, "Would you consider being my personal assistant?" And so Anne accepted that. And that acceptance, of course, brought Joanna into my life. And Anne worked behind the scenes the way she does with me to get me to go to some of Joanna's intensives. And I did. In fact, Anne likes to say that she organized as Joanna's assistant one of the first men-only Work That Reconnects retreats back in the early, I think it was 2009, 2010, 2009, specifically to get me to go, because she knew I would show up if it was for men. So then and that just kind of started us on the journey. And I sat with Joanna, and we shared a friendship. And Joanna was a Buddhist scholar, and she was also a living systems thinker. That was what she got her PhD in. She's a brilliant person and a magician or a shaman. I mean, her ability to do ritual, I haven't really run into anybody that is able to do what she did. And by ritual, I mean she was able to create a container in which the work that was done. So the work that reconnects is our exercises to reconnect ourselves to ourselves, reconnect to others, and reconnect to the world, to creation. All of those splits, to heal all those splits. And it's experiential work. It's not a doctrine or content so much, although she would teach about living systems theory, and she did have some brain food, as she would call it. And now, since she died, and certainly as she was getting older, she was 96 when she died, her work has just gone out like the seeds of a dandelion, just all on the winds, including the men's work. We do truth mandalas, and that was developed by Joanna in Germany right after the wall came down. And so it's really been gratifying to watch her work move out into the world and influence the men's work that we do, as well as so many other aspects of what's going on today.
Yeah, beautiful. We've kind of laid some of the groundwork there in terms of tracing the threads, but I want to get back to you in terms of your own narrative thread, your own soul thread. You have this heart attack. You decide to go to the MROP the next chance you get. What really kind of changed there for you? What did you? I'm sure there would have been at least some kind of realization or shift that you maybe became aware of only in hindsight, or maybe you were conscious of even as it was happening. But what was compelling about that kind of that moment for you? And I suspect it might lead to why you're still here today.
It's a question that I often ask myself because the answer changes as time goes on. You know, the question is the same, but the answer, I'm different. So it always strikes me a little bit differently. I would have to say that I'm one of those guys who went through the Emerald P and walked out kind of like, oh, that was okay. No, no, no tremendous mystical experience or dreams or, nothing that I could really say that shook me to my core, you know, like a heart attack. But again, now as I look back, my answer has also changed. I mean, and that was at that time. I look back now and I wrote a letter to my father on the day of solitude when I was out there. And I hadn't really written a letter like that to him before. And it was really just trying to express my gratitude for who he was able to show up as. So there's that. And he never answered. He didn't die till a few years later, but he never answered. So I just want to say, sometimes it's not like, and they lived happily ever after. But I did write the letter, and that was important. And I knew he got it. So I did that. And I think that was important for me in my own journey, both having been fathered and being a father. And then if there was anything else, it was just a sense, kind of a very subtle sense that I needed to do work with men, for me and for men. I needed to be involved in the work that Richard was doing and that the men that I knew here in Northern California were doing when they were already forming chapters long before Illuman, regional chapters long before Illuman existed. There was a sense like a magnet. I need to be involved in this work. I knew that. It wasn't desperate, but it was very solid. It was that just a sure kind of a certainty that if I was going to walk this path of whatever this heart attack meant and whoever I am and what this life is about, then I need to be involved in this kind of work.
Well, and because of, your age and your kind of situation, both having served in the Marines, having been a Franciscan, having been an attorney, you have a lot. I mean, there's a bunch of different places from which I think you've observed, even as a kid, growing up, what does it even mean to be a man? And that the story I tell myself is not only has that, kind of your response or your growing awareness continued to evolve around that over time, but it's also continued to evolve for all of us. I mean, there's been societal, it's actually been something that's been questioned by everybody, and some certain parts have been getting reaffirmed. And I think there's just been a sense of like, there's been a lot that's been thrown up into the wind and is still waiting to see where it lands. How is, from your position, like how have you observed this evolution or this kind of ongoing conversation about how you would respond to even that question you mentioned that you've asked time and time again of what does it mean to be a man?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to ponder it from the span of my life. I'm 73, just turned 73. So I was born in the early 50s, grew up in the 60s. That was my teenage years. And when all the hormones hit and everything else, and it was like, here we are. So I would say the way that question, if I'm understanding your question correctly, the way that the question about what does it mean to be a man and what is men's work, I think has certainly changed for me, not only because I've changed, but everything around me has changed. When I first asked that question in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, for the most part, it was very clear. It seemed, now this is all my opinion, but also my experience. It seemed very clear. There are men and there are women. And then there's some people in there that we don't really know about them, you know. And I wasn't raised with any judgments, Christian judgments, because I wasn't raised as a Christian around gay men or gay women or whatever. But they were there, and I really, anyway, but it was certain that there were two genders. That was just there. There was no question about that. And then there was the women's movement, and that question, like, well, culturally, what does gender mean? And then there was the LGBTQ movement in the late 70s and 80s. And then it was like, oh, wow, I really need to pay attention to these people. These people have an experience, and their experience needs to be taken into account. And what does that mean for me? And then, more recently, I mean, just it seems like the blink of an eye. And this has changed so fast in these generations. Now we have non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid. And I live in a community where 10%, maybe upwards of 20% of the people identify as one of those, or just non-binary. Don't put me in a category. Now, in the 60s, that would have been unthinkable to me. I wouldn't have been able to wrap my mind around that. Now I'm listening to it, and I'm listening to these people, and I'm hearing about their experience, and I'm like, whoa, now what does this mean? What an amazing thing that's happening to the human species. Of course, this isn't just happening in isolation. This is happening in the unraveling of our world on so many, ecologically, socially, so many things are unraveling. And so in the midst of all that, is this just part of the unraveling, or is this something that's being born? Is this being midwifed into our human experience? Or is this just a symptom? This gender questioning, this gender fluidity, is this just a questioning of or an unraveling of what should be? I'm putting that in air quotes. I tend to lean that this is new birth. This is something coming in that we're being asked to midwife. Do I know what that means or what that will look like? I don't know. But what does men's work look like when there are so many people that have the experience of not being a man, but also not being a woman in the, gender wise? We had, I'll end with this. We had a Jerry retreat here at Canticle Farm, which is the community that my wife and I founded. And the Jerry is Gender Equity and Reconciliation International. And they do gender work. Reconciliation. That's why it's named that. And I've done it twice. Once with, both times in connection with Illuman. Once as the chair. There were chairs of different organizations that were called in, including Illuman and MKP, to experience Jerry weekend. And then we did one at Ghost Ranch with Illuman men and their partners, more or less their partners or. Anyway, so we did one of those retreats here at Canticle Farm, and their usual way of forming the retreat and the groups is people who identify as women and people who identify as men. And then in our community, they decided, because of the feedback, we're going to have a third group, and it's going to be non-binary. And so, again, I'm going down that route because this is new. It's new wineskins and it's new wine. And I really want to pay attention to it. And I'm trying to have it inform my own understanding of my own gender and who I am as a cisgendered, heterosexual, identified man. And I'm not sure if I answered your question whatsoever, but please help me to clarify or extend if I need to say more about that.
Well, I think we're going to my guess is that we're going to agree that masculinity is not the same thing as being a man or being male, right? That the masculine and the feminine are, we might say that they're like archetypal energies that are present in everybody.
Yes.
And there might be third energies as well, or fourth or other energies as well that we're not, but masculine and feminine have often been kind of identified, and maybe unhelpfully in fact, I would say for sure unhelpfully, often masculinity has been defined in opposition to femininity as opposed to what it stands for, maybe in its own right. It's been, when it's been seen as unhealthy, it's been, well, I'm not that, I'm not that, I'm not that, and what's left is kind of this very rigid, small way of expressing yourself as a man. But
Yeah.
but that's still, I'm just, I think that one of the themes we've been kind of working within Illumin in this last year is what is sacred about masculinity? What is the gift that masculinity has to offer the world, regardless of what your body is, and or how you identify. For understandably so, men have been received an enormous amount of criticism, in the last number of years, which we both get it, why that's, why that's the case. But I also know that it's not, that's only helpful to the extent that it helps us kind of start to realize and see through some of the kind of the broken, too small patterns or wineskins, if you want to use that metaphor, that we've been handed. But it doesn't, where it falls short is helping us, I'll say, recover, because I think it's something that it's not like we're not starting from scratch. We're not reimagining with a blank slate, but it's actually going back to maybe something that is more ancient and is the root, kind of a root archetypally about, well, this is actually the gift that masculinity has to offer to the world. So I'm curious to know if you have a sense there, like words, and I'll just, grant us both permission to say that we are in a place of emergence. And so whatever you and I would say to this as a response, the danger would always be to say, yeah, well, this is it. It's like, well, actually, we're both kind of watching this in real time, as a flourishing conversation. And some of the kind of the stakes that have been put into the ground, I'm like, oh man, that's not. I'd say, well, I don't think that's it. That's, but and I would have some of my own responses to this question, but I'm curious about you. Like, how would you, what are some of the things you would use to describe the sacredness of masculinity and the gifts that masculinity has to offer the world?
Well, thank you, Ned. I mean, that is such a profound question. Thank you for all that you said leading up to it. And I hesitate to answer because I'm not sure that we even have the language yet to really. We've been handed some old wineskins, and there's new wine, and I don't want to put the new wine into old wineskins. The language that we've been given, I don't think works anymore. I mean, so what does work? Well, I think poetry works, metaphor works, ritual works. So before I start doing exactly what I'm warning against, I think that if I were absolutely accurate, I would recite a poem, or I would write a poem, even better, or I would dance it, or I would sing it, or I would do some ritual in answer, like some Zen master, in answer to your question, what is masculinity, or what is the sacred masculine? I mean, because it's not only masculinity that we have lost any sense of like coherence around. What's sacred, right? I mean, the religious forms that we've been given, the religious institutions that we have that have handed on whatever we've received, they are disappearing. And I can get lost, and you can bring me back, but I'm going to go down a little path here to the side a little bit, because I've been reading a book by Thomas Avlik, who's a Czech priest, called The Afternoon of Christianity. It's just an amazing book. And he points out in that book, he's a sociologist as well as an ordained priest in Czech Republic, who has gone through, of course, the communist regimes and things like that. But he's also looked at the West. And he points out that, the institutions, the religious institutions that exist now, do not hold a monopoly. The way he puts it is, do not hold a monopoly on religious experience. And that just shook me in a good way. It was like, Well, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing in Illuman. We are picking up the slack that the institutional religions can no longer hold. They have passed it on to us. And there are, of course, other organizations and other ways that spirituality, it's all this, the young people especially that say to me and to others, you too probably, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. And, we can kind of look at that and go like, what do you mean? But I get it in the sense that Thomas Havlik just, the way he framed it, that spirituality and religion, which are being, they're blowing taps for it right now, that it's dying. Just as it's dying, it's as if, just like Jesus said, if a grain of wheat falls to the ground, unless it does, it's not going to produce fruit. But if it does, whoa, stand back. And I think that's what's happening with the churches. Thich Nhat Hanh and Thomas Merton, back in 1968, these are two men with decades of monastic experience within a very constrained religious forms. They agreed that the age of institutional religion is over. 1968, they knew that. They could see that was happening. And it was Karl Rahner who said, either Christians will be mystics in the 21st century or they won't at all. So let's circle back around to your question of sacred masculinity. So I'll say right there with Karl Rahner, we have to be mystics. I would say the sacred masculine is a mystic. He is in touch with his core. He is in touch with the divine. He knows how to dance with the divine. He knows how to listen to the divine. He knows how to let the divine have its way with him. That's got to be a quote from Jim Taylor, right? So, and I identify as a Christian, and I would have to explain to you what that means, probably, if we were going to continue to talk about that. But so Jesus means something to me. His life means something to me. So at the end of his life, weeping, tortured, he says, and your will be done. I can barely say that without choking up myself. It's like, no. I'm standing here. I can see there's two things going on here. There's my will and there's your will. But I want my will and your will to be together. And so he says, your will be done. So, and that was about sacrifice. And that's not about sacrificing other people. We will do that in a heartbeat. We will sacrifice the marginalized, the oppressed, the poor, the whoever. We will do that. And we will, as we will do that. And the sacred masculine steps into that place of sacrifice, on the cross and offers itself, and says, I see your pain and I will carry your pain as well as my pain. I will see your pain and I will carry it. I will carry it with you, but I will carry my pain. I'm not going to transmit my pain to you. We all probably have heard in Illuman Richard's phrase, if you don't transform it, you will transmit it. And so, what does the sacred masculine do? I'll wrap it up here, Ned. I think there's all of that. And then there's, we help to transform pain. There's a lot of pain out there, a lot of trauma. It shows up in our relationships as conflict. And it's the way shadow and trauma show up. And then we have conflict. And we're working in Illuman right now to try to really take a look at how we deal with conflict and how, in my belief, that is the transformative engine, is conflict, working with trauma and shadow. If we don't do that, then I don't know what's being transformed, right? I mean, I don't know what we're doing. So I'm very excited about working with shadow and trauma, and I think it's the masculine that can lead that. I'm not saying that the feminine doesn't do it, that the feminine really holds it in a way. And now I'm going to start getting into, the opposites here. And I really want to be careful about that because last thing I'm going to say about it, because whatever we say, whatever the role, I read this just the other day, the role of a father is to provide protection, to provide and play. Protection, provide, and play. That's what your role as a father is. I love that. I love that. And I don't want to get stuck on that, because that's going to manifest itself in each man in his own way. And so, I want to be able to work with concepts and categories, and then, like shake the dust from my feet as soon as I've used them, and really look at, like what's happening, and appreciate what the concrete is and what's happening in each man's life.
Yeah, thank you so much. Beautiful response. And not to make a big deal out of this, but just while it's right here on the table, particularly this notion of the man as provider, or sometimes I hear it as producer. Like the person who brings home the bacon. I think this has really been first of all, it's a very recent idea. I don't think people they think that that's like, oh, isn't that how it's always been? Well, no, not at all. For most of history, we as the human species has been not had the kind of the luxury of saying, well, we could just have one of the just the man is the one who's going to kind of provide and produce, and the woman can, I don't know, I suppose, like stay at home, but actually for most of history, I think both have been involved in, just to use the phrase, to bringing home the bacon. But in modernity, this has been a particular, this idea kind of got started, and I think it's actually set men back. And for a while, it really constrained women too, until they kind of, I think, thankfully, women, I think, are probably 20 years ahead of us here. And they've broken free largely of that constraint. But guys have not broken free of that constraint yet. And they still, I think, still see themselves as like, that's like some ideal that they're supposed to live up to. And I think that if we understand it as something that all humans are a part of, the creative process, whatever it is that we're creating and bringing into kind of, bringing into, whether it's tending a field or like designing a building or whatever it is, there's a certain kind of production that I think goes with being human. But this is a tough one, particularly I think as we see young men struggle so much in the workforce, and in schools, you can look at it and say that in some ways the way we've set up the knowledge economy has been, in a manner that men have not been able to kind of keep up, and they're falling behind. And with AI and robotics, we'll see how this plays out. But the expectation of a lot of people is that there's going to be fewer jobs in the future, not more, and there's going to be more leisure time, which I suppose works if if you already have capital or you have some way of producing. But there's going to be what we see now could be, what happens if, you take away all the truckers in a nation because now Waymo is driving the trucks for everyone. It's like, that's a big deal, so, and it's those types of things are going to be. So I say all of this because I just think it is important for men. Every time we bring up the idea of man as provider or man as producer, which is a modern idea, this is, men have their egoic identity in our culture more maybe from this than anything else. And I think we got to keep naming it for the myth that I think it is. You also said something else there I wanted to kind of get some more. So it sounds to me like you're saying that you think the biggest challenge facing men today in embracing their authentic self is the shadow and unhealed trauma, those two things you named. To somebody who doesn't even know what the shadow is, and is like, well, how is that getting in my way? How is that a challenge for me? How would you describe that?
Yeah. Wow, I'm still kind of stuck on some of the other stuff that you said because it was so provocative.
Yeah, that's okay. You can go there too if you'd rather go there. That's totally fine.
No. I would. Yeah, we can always talk about these things, Ned. So let's talk about the shadow. This is what I would say to someone who says, like, what's the shadow? It's those parts of yourself. I follow the definition that I think is aligned with what Carl Jung said. I know there's a lot of different ways that shadow is talked about. Even in Illuman, there are
Yeah.
different
Yeah.
ways that men hold
Yeah.
shadow. So let me just be clear about what I mean by shadow. It's those things that we don't know. We don't know our shadow. It's those parts of us that are got repressed, that we expelled. Basically, we exiled them as we were growing up. And in my own understanding and opinion, why did we do that? Because we were very wise and said, well, I can't really use this. No, we did it because when those parts of us showed up, traumatic things happened. Something happened and probably painful, very painful or scary or terrorizing. And so we said, that's the last time, this is all unconscious, of course. Our unconscious said, that's the last time that we're going to let that thing show up. Boom, it's out, it's gone. And so then if you don't know it, well, how do you work on it? And then I would say, well, it's like a black hole. You don't see a black hole. You cannot see a black hole because no light escapes from it. But you know it's there. How do they know it's there? Because it influences everything around it. And so, you can be in a group, so as an example, and you're following a process. And then have you ever been in that process, and then all of a sudden you kind of think and go like, what's going on here? What are we doing? It's like something has gone sideways, but it's not real clear what happened. Or it could be something like this. So that's an influence of the shadow, I would say. That's that black hole bending light. Something is going on that you just can't put your finger on, and you're feeling a little uneasy, and you don't know. You can't see it. You can't really point to it. There are some behaviors, but they I would say they're shadow influenced. Again, the way I would talk about shadow is like something isn't just shadow or just light or this or that. It's like we're all influenced by shadow. It's everywhere. Some things are more influenced by shadow. Some situations are more influenced by shadow than other situations. And so it would show up in patterns. Here's another way. I mean, I'm just going through some ways that the shadow shows up.
And let me just
with my wife.
Let me
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
interject real quick to say, just to note then that the shadow is not something that's necessarily negative, that there's as much good things and glorious parts of ourselves that we suppress because we can't handle them. And there's often, there might be just as much gold, if not more, in our shadow than there might be, say, like broken or wounded parts. And I don't even know if broken or wounded is the right way to phrase it, but often when people I have heard this within Illuminists, people talk about the shadow parts as like the bad parts of themselves. And that's certainly not what Jung would understand, and not what the way you and I would agree with that. So
Absolutely not.
yeah. So go ahead.
My joyful, playful boy was put into at least aspects of it were put into my shadow in order to survive school. To survive our school system. I was one of the kids that always wanted to talk, and they would have I would have probably been diagnosed with something back, and they would have given me a drug for it back when I was a kid, because sitting in a row and being quiet and just sitting, I was not, so yeah, there's really positive energies and aspects of ourselves. There's the brilliant child that, shows up and is like the king or the queen of, archetype that shows up that the parents just can't handle because they're too busy, they're too stressed, they're too whatever. And it's like, we don't want to see that, or they'll say things like, don't brag or don't boast or, something like that. I'm just trying to talk about, how does it happen that our parts that are what we would call positive, again, air quotes, those aspects of ourselves that have joy and energy and brilliance to them, how do they get into the shadow? Well, they also show up, and the world doesn't have the capacity see them. I'm going to try to remember a quote that really struck me one time, and I can't remember who said it. Actually, it was a guy in a council said, "Our fathers did not have the capacity to love us and to cherish us for who we were." And because our fathers were wounded and we and lacked capacity and had been treated a certain way themselves, when we showed up as these brilliant, wonderful, just gorgeous young boys, they couldn't handle it because we tell ourselves, because I'm a father also, we tell ourselves, well, he can't show up like that. If he shows up like that, the world will kick his ass. He will really be hurt if he keeps doing that or acting that way. So yeah, all of this stuff gets into the shadow because it's survival. This is a strategy. Our ego has the job of helping us survive, and the ego sits there and says, not that, and that's okay because it seems to be acceptable. So, yeah, there's different ways. I could continue down different ways we can recognize the shadow influence, but I would say basically you've got a shadow, and right now, in this very moment, your psyche, your soul is doing everything it possibly can to get you to face your shadow. And it's going to be people you don't like. It's going to be, you say that you're integrating your feminine, but this woman that's next to you, you just can't stand, and those kind of women keep showing up, but I want to integrate my feminine, so it's the shadow working in so many different ways. I would say in every way, to complete our wholeness. And that's through trauma and shadow work in my mind. I don't know how else you get there. It's hard work. It's really hard work. When it's coming up into my awareness, how I've been or how I've acted or how I've thought or how I've treated people, how I have treated myself, that's a hard thing. It can make or break a life, as David White says.
And of course, like I don't want to just hang this on our fathers, because it's a bigger problem than who our single father was. We could have a wonderful father, but it's just in the water. So it's women do as much gender policing as men, of young boys, and and certainly from a very young age, young boys are learning to police each other, and so
Yeah.
this is kind of the chicken and the egg problem of like, how do we, you need a holistic, healthy container for young boys to be able to like preserve more of their, of the palette of their humanity. And the only way to create that container is to have healthy men and women who are holding that container. But it just becomes a self-fulfilling kind of spiral in either direction, towards health or towards further shadow. And not further shadow, but I mean that's true, but that's not necessarily what I mean. But we'll say towards further suppression, towards further, we'll just say like broken notions of what it means to be a human and broken notions of what it means to be a man. So, and I think that's part of the hope for what Illuman is doing, is that we are one, and we're not the only ones, thankfully, but one place where we're attempting to create and hold those containers, not only for ourselves, but for future generations, especially.
Yeah. Well, I would introduce a word. I know it's provocative, but I would introduce the word patriarchy. Will Keepan, who is a founder of the Gender Equity and Reconciliation International, said that we all have male privilege, and our male privilege is to deconstruct patriarchy. That we are at a time where it is our job. This is the task we've been given as men in this time, is to deconstruct patriarchy. So since I'm using the word now, I want to be careful about, what I mean by it. Again, I also am aligned with St. Paul, who thinks there are dominions and powers in this world. W.H. Auden, the poet, said, we are lived by powers we pretend to understand. So I would say patriarchy points to a power that had its grip on our fathers and our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers maybe for thousands of years. I don't know. I'm not one of those people who can point to a particular point and say, oh, that's when it all started. I like the Genesis myth. It's like from the beginning, right there. It's like, what, just there it is. There's problems. So patriarchy harms women and it benefits men.
And,
But
and it harms men.
and it harms men and it benefits women. And the way I've heard men talk about it is, I live with a partner who would rather see me die on my horse than get off of it, my charger, as the warrior, than fall off it. So I think that's a really important step. And I don't know as a culture that we've done that yet, that really acknowledged that the benefits and the harm go in both directions. I can tell you what the harm was for me. With the form of masculinity or manhood that I grew up with, I can look at that man, and I'm still working to try to heal him. The guy that tried to form himself to be that kind of a man. And so, and to me, that's what patriarchy is. It's not just benefiting men. It's telling men that they have to do things like be a provider in a system where that choice or that capacity is very limited and will require you to leave your wild one behind, your beautiful person behind, and you will chain yourself to a desk for 30 years with the promise of somehow you're going to retire someday and then you're going to enjoy life. I mean, it's terrible. So to me, that's patriarchy. That's part of the patriarchal system that puts men into those kind of positions and says, yeah, aren't you happy now? Isn't this your life? Isn't this the way life is supposed to be? No, it's not. And I think that's where Illuman, men can come together and we can look at each other and we can say, really, is this what life is about? Because most of us who come, something's happened, right? When we come to Illuman, we're coming because something's happened to have us ask that question. It's the very first question. Now that I've invoked Genesis, it's the first question in the Bible, in the biblical canon. God, where are you? And I think that's such a beautiful question on so many different levels. Like, where are you? Where are you? Where are you? And then the first question that Jesus asked, and I think these are questions for Illumin. These are questions that in the journey of illumination, these are questions we wrestle with in Illumin. The first question Jesus asks when he turns around and looks at these guys following him, he says, what do you want? What is it that you want? Two beautiful questions. Where are you and what do you want? And there are other questions in that canon that I think are really, help us as men in Illumin to start to understand our journey of illumination. Yeah.
So I appreciate this conversation, kind of opening the can of worms on patriarchy. This is one example where I think I hear the left and the right kind of just speaking past each other, using two different definitions for the same word, and then feeling frustrated that the other side disagrees. But like if we were, so which is why I'm grateful that you define it, and the way I'm hearing it defined is that patriarchy has to do with a certain way of holding power over others. That has to do with dominance. And
women can do that just as well as men.
Absolutely.
It's a little harder for them in our culture, but the fact that they can do it.
Yes. I remember being not too long ago with some women, and they said, with a woman actually, and she said, she thought that the answer is that women should just be in control for the next about 50 or 100 years, and they should just rule everything. It's like, well, that sounds an awful lot like patriarchy to me, because it doesn't matter whether it's a man or a woman in charge with that dominating power. It's still the same, And it strikes me what you said earlier about what it means to be a man in your mind, the sacred masculine aspect, to be a mystic, which is to say that you stand in solidarity with those who are suffering, right? And when you're in solidarity with those who are suffering, by definition, you're standing with and next to and under and in support of, but not over. And this starts to, two of your, I know, great teachers, Francis and Jesus both seem to have a radically different understanding of how to use the power. And they both were powerful men. I mean, both were very powerful men. And St. Paul, I would use this as well. I mean, St. Paul also very powerful man, and he was very clear that it was his power was not to be used to dominate others, but this sense of surrender. And often, I think when I do hear my friends who are kind of traditionally conservative, who talk about the healthy patriarchs, and they want to like keep that phrase. They're talking about men like that. They're talking about men who were willing to lay their lives down for those that they loved, for those that they didn't even know, their neighbor, for those who lived on other sides of oceans. And the best of all, Jesus' invitation to lay your life down even for your enemy. I do kind of think that's a beautiful understanding of a kind of patriarchy, very different than the kind of patriarchy that dominates, but is the kind of sacred masculinity embodied by Jesus, by Francis, by by others that would stand in solidarity and use their power for the kind of the common flourishing of life.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a question in there. That's what's coming up for me as I'm hearing you kind of reflect on that.
Yeah. I would add, just to be, well, first of all, patriarch and patriarchy, that's an unfortunate similarity in words. I'm not talking about the patriarchs at all. That's a whole different subject. But the power that I'm talking about when I use the word patriarchy, it's power that's based on fear. It doesn't work without fear. That patriarchy that I'm talking about. I remember there was a friar. This is the most powerful prayer I've ever heard in my life. How's that for an introduction?
Okay.
We were in a small group and we were just sharing, and then we went into prayer and we were vocalizing some prayers. And this friar, who was probably one of the most unassuming men that one of the most I've ever run into. I mean, just very humble, very. I want to say unassuming in that way. His prayer was this. He says, "May no one ever be afraid of me." And that struck me because I looked at him and I thought, why would anyone ever be afraid of you? You seem like the most innocent, kind of harmless person. Not powerful, but harmless. And then I realized that he was probably that way because he had been saying that prayer a long time. And I tried to pick it up as my own prayer. And I haven't been very good at it because I've really been conditioned by my patriarchal training. That everything is based on fear, domination, competition, and we do it against each other. And so, that's the patriarchy, the thing that sets brothers against brothers all the time. To see ourselves as competitors, as foes, as someone, with a scarcity mentality. To me, that is the effect of patriarchy. So that's what I want to get rid of that. That's why this work is so important in Illuman, is so that we don't have to fear other men, whether they're the ones next to us or the ones across the ocean. I'm going to pause there. I could just go on and on, Ned, but I want to make sure that I'm actually responding to, the things you want to talk about here and get into this podcast.
Well, I think we're both kind of trying to track the trail of breadcrumbs to see where we're both being led in this. One thing that you mentioned just in the last 5 minutes or so for the first time was this interesting term of the Journey of Illumination. And this is a kind of a phrase that we did not invent, and neither did Richard. Actually, Richard borrowed it. I think you can explain the history of this here in a second. But when he kind of bequeathed his gift to Illuman, he didn't just give us the men's rites of passage. He gave us this kind of enigmatic idea of the journey of illumination, which has been something we've been wrestling with for some time. And it's kind of beautiful that it's been, in some level, something that we've had trouble defining or articulating, because I think and especially over the last year or so, you have been working with a few men in Illuman to kind of have a special focused wrestling and listening to the broader community around, hey, what is it? What does this journey of illumination look like for a variety, really for all of the different men in the community? And it can get lost because there's something about it that is resists being pinned down. And that's not a problem to be solved. It's a benefit. I would say it's actually maybe part of the gift that it has to offer us. But I'd love to hear you define, first of all, just walk us through where this phrase came from, and this notion of an ecology of spiritual practices, and kind of give us a rundown on where, if you were to take the role of kind of being a mirror for Illuman and our relationship to this idea of the journey of illumination, what would you say?
Well, first off, I want to say there were a few of us that were given the task of what is the journey? Work with this question. What is the journey of illumination? And that was Chris Cleghorn, Joel Aurund, and Bill Weber and myself. And we're continuing. We came out with our first document that was given to the Council of Elders and to the board and out to the conveners as a kind of let's say a signpost or a tentative, not definition. I really want to stay away from trying to define the journey of illumination, but what is it, as like you're pointing out, we're using the term like an ecology of spiritualities. And so I'll get more into that after I talk about where did that phrase come from. Richard and Stephen Pica started using the phrase primarily around the time when they realized that the rites of passage shouldn't be just a one-off. Like there's enlightenment and then that's it. It was like, no, this is more of a path or a journey. And so they started talking about the journey of illumination back in the 2000s up to 2010, 11, when it was brought into Illuman. And I spoke with Richard last summer and said, we're working with this phrase and we're not even sure where it came from. When did you start using it and why? And he said that he used that term based on a book by a woman named Evelyn Underhill, who wrote it around the turn of the century, last century, 1800s into the 1900s. I don't know the exact date of the book, and it was called Mysticism, I think, just Mysticism. And in that book, she outlined 3 phases of what we would call the journey of illumination. There's the purgative phase, where there's the purging of what needs to be released and left behind. Then there's the illuminative stage, and then there's the unitive stage. And that language became quite prevalent in religious circles in the 1900s, last century. And that's was Richard's. He said he liked the phrase illuminative, and so he started talking about the journey of illumination. So that's where the phrase came from. And so we were using it, and it's really all over our literature. And what we realized about maybe 2 years ago or so is very explicitly at the level of the board and the program council and curricula council and others. It's like, we're using this term. What does it mean? What does it really mean? And so for a year, the 4 of us gathered opinions and feedback from all the leadership groups within Illuman, and asked the conveners to also hold councils with their chapters. And then we took that information as well as our own research. And what we've come up with is it's an ecology. And I want to give credit where it's due. The ecology of spiritualities actually comes from a Substack by a guy named Nicholas Michelson. He also has an amazing article on AI that like changed my whole thinking about AI. You had mentioned it earlier, and that came to mind. But Nicholas Michelson talking about how what we need are ecologies to create of spirituality, to create the people we need, the humanity that we need at this time. And so that phrase, ecologies, just kind of opened up things for us. It's not that we even necessarily know what that means or have nailed it down, but it's a bigger thing than just a one-page definition or a paragraph. This is the Journey of Illumination. We're not doing that. It's more like a field that you walk into, and it is like a whole ecosystem. So everything is there working together, and you can go to any part of it to identify, resources that you can use, resources that have helped other men. That's what we're not just making it up. We're using the resources, teachers, books, practices, other communities that have helped other men on their journey of illumination. That has come in. That's part of it. But also to help men identify, well, one, that they have a journey of illumination. I remember Jim Taylor saying in one of the films that we had, like, we're all on a spiritual journey. We're all on a spiritual journey. The only question is, whether we're aware of it or not. And so it's like that realization for a man coming into the ecologies of spiritualities, or this thing that we're trying to create, is to help him. He's got a glimpse of it maybe, or he thinks he has a spiritual journey, and then he can come into this ecology and say, oh yeah, I see that. That's mirroring my experience. And here's resources for him to go. But it'll also help to him to frame the right questions. Someone once said that the most destructive thing around is the right answer to the wrong question. And I think in Illumin we have done that. I think sometimes we ask the wrong question, but we get the right answer, and then it really doesn't help at all. So it's really important to ask the right questions. And again, that's what the Journey of Illumination, as a community, we can help men to ask the questions that are, the kind of questions that are going to be helpful. We've already said a couple of them in my mind, like, where are you? What do you want? How about, at the resurrection appearances, Jesus asked Mary Magdalene, Mary the Tower, not a place, it's a tower. She's Mary the Tower, like, why are you weeping? I think that's a beautiful question for any man at this time. And he's going to say, no, I'm not crying. What do you mean? I'm not crying. Oh yeah, you are. Brother, you are. You just don't know it. Why are you weeping? And who are you looking for? Those are the two questions that Jesus asked at the very end. It's like, there's questions for you. Why are you weeping? What are you grieving? And who are you looking for? I'm standing right in front of you. If you're looking for me, here I am. But maybe you're looking for yourself. Maybe you're looking for yourself. Good question. So that's the Journey of Illumination. It's not an answer. It's an invitation.
If you were to trace back for yourself, Terry, like, what would you say have been, and it did, I mean, you've already named some of these things, but how would you define is the absolute wrong word. How would you describe your own journey of illumination over the years?
Well, so I would just say that, my journey of illumination has always been prodded and fired and fueled by questions that just, I can't shake them. They're just, they're not the same questions, or all the time. And even if they are the same, like, what does it mean to be a man? It changes, over the meaning of it changes over time. And it's the trying to live into those questions. What was it Rilke said? Live the questions. It's living those questions that has been my journey of illumination.
Now, as an elder, you're kind of, you've crossed into a different kind of season of life in the last few years. How has the questions changed for you as an elder?
Well, certainly my relationship with grief and grief work has changed. To grieve as a young man is very different than to grieve as an older man. And that grief can take many different forms. But there's a sense at the toward the end of life when you know that some things just are, you know. And in fact, you've lived your life and you've made some of your choices, and they just are. And some of those you can rejoice in and celebrate, and some of those choices have harmed people and have harmed yourself. Myself, I have made choices and decisions that have harmed myself, have harmed people I love, and so that. Not that a young man can't feel that, but as an older man, the idea, you know, which is in some sense an illusion that I have time to make this right. It's not, no, not necessarily. You may go to your grave. I may go to my grave, not having made this thing right, be in right relationship with this particular thing. I don't want to make that too dogmatic. I mean, there are ways to work with things, but I hope you're getting, I'm just trying to get a sense of like the grieving over that sense is different. So there's my relationship with grief. And then there's my relationship with just life in the sense of like my ability to bless life, to bless others, to learn to do that. I'm still learning to do that. Because I like to think I'm still a first stage elder. I'm still learning, but to bless life, to just like sit back and go, yeah, wow, you know, I understand what's going on. That's really, it's hard or it's joyful or whatever, and I'm just here with you in that. That's a bless you for that work, bless what you're doing. You're on the journey, you know. That's what it's all about. You know, and less of the critical mind, less of the assessor and the contraster and the comparer and all that, which as a 1 in the Enneagram, I'm like so good at that, right? So, yeah, there's two aspects. Those are 2 aspects, blessing and grief, you know, that have really become more of a focus on that, those 2 things.
Mm-hmm.
Did that answer your question? I'm not sure that I answered your question.
No, it does, and it strikes me that, you know, really the level to which you can engage one of those deepens your ability to engage the other, and that you can't. It's no coincidence that those are the 2 you name. You know that, you know, there's the beautiful Mary Oliver poem where she talks. Well, she says, "One summer I went every day to the edge of a pond." Now that's, by the way, I mean, what a beautiful practice to start out with, right? "One summer I went every day to the edge of a pond where a huddle of just hatched geese would climb up to me," and I'm going to slaughter the poem a bit, but this is the gist of it, and climb up over my body, peeping and staring. Such goodness every day, which the old ones, the parent geese, you know, which the old ones allowed and watched for whatever reason serenely. And then she goes on and she talks about how they grew, you know, and with their, you know, over the course of the summer, watching their bodies grow, and this continued practice. But one of them remained, you know, she says 5 of them grew strong of body and wing, and one remained with its gauze-like feathers, its wings that would not grow. And then she says, and then it was fall. Then it was fall. And this is what I've come to decide everything is about. Everything is about. The way, you know, I held with joy those 5 and 2 that flew away. That's the blessing, you know, peace. And the way I held in my heart the one that had to stay.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what that calls to mind is the what Richard's book, Everything Belongs. You know, to move into elderhood, I think there's a sense where we find, you know, that there is, our hearts are big enough, and I'll invoke Joanna Macy here. Why are our hearts big enough you know, when we're elders? Because, as she says, a broken heart can hold the world. You know, our hearts have been broken enough, hopefully by that time, that it can hold the world, and everything belongs in those hearts. Everything belongs. I do have 3 sons, and they're in their 20s and early 30s, and nephews, and certainly I've in our own community here, I've been in relationship with younger men. I I both celebrate who they are and what they're being faced with as an amazing opportunity, and I am afraid because it's a big challenge. They're facing an unraveling that I never had to face. They have to face an unraveling of our economic system and our social systems and our institutions, our educational institutions. That I saw the beginning of it. The 60s were not like all honey and sweetness, but these young men are facing a future. At least I had hope. I'm not sure that they have hope. I had hope that I could live a better life. It was an eschatological, it was the reduction of the eschatological hope that we have down to, kind of an enlightenment, idea of progress. But at least I had that, and I'm not, the young men today really, so it's not out there. So this is what I tell the young men. And I try to tell my sons, but the father-son relationship is a tough one sometimes. But it's not out there. You're not going to find it in the economic system, the meaning and your purpose in life. You're not going to find it. It will keep you going for a bit, and you can use it. But you're going to have to find your way through your heart and through your own relationship with the sacred, with the divine. And as you do that in your own solitary way, not as a separate autonomous individual, but as a man, find others that are doing it, and walk with them, accompany them. They will accompany you. And that kind of brings me right back to Illuman.
Yep.
We do this work. No one can do this work for you. You are on your own. Absolutely, each one of us, and we can do it together. It seems a paradox, but it's not. I don't hold Illuman as necessary or like or my community Canticle Farm. I hold both of these things as they are experiments. They're not. I don't know if they're going to last 2 years or 20 years or whatever. But the work that they do is, what actually happens within the containers, that's going to continue. As you said, I want to reflect that back. I think of, what is Illumin doing? Sometimes I think of it this way, in an unraveling world, in a world that's going through its own initiation. There's something being born here that's just incredible. And the Earth is going through an initiation. So what does Earth need? If Earth were going to raise up a species or a people that could help with this process of Earth initiation, you would want men who know initiation, who have been through initiation, who know what transformation is. And so that's what we're doing. And that's going to happen through different means and through different structures, I believe, because we are, of course, involved in something much bigger than ourselves, much bigger than Illumin, much bigger than the United States, much bigger than even Earth. The Genesis story doesn't say it's, just Earth that's being created. There's a story here that's bigger than all of us. So as much as we can show up in that story and to live that story and to facilitate that story happening, I think is what we're here to do. And I pray that my sons and that the young people, your sons and the young people, sons and daughters, can find their way. And again, if Illumin can help that, then yes, absolutely. We need that.
Terry, thank you so much for your not only your time today, but your faithful service. Your continued tireless presence in our community and in the world in general. It's been a real gift to be in your sphere of influence. I know it's been a blessing for me as it has been for many. So wonderful to chat today, and looking forward to many more conversations in future years.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ed. I've really, Ned, I've really enjoyed this time and the opportunity to think about these things in a focused way and to verbalize a little bit, of some of the things I've pondered and to be able to share it. It's an opportunity I really appreciate. Thank you.